Oftentimes, when I go onto Google Maps, I will look at the Canadian Shield. This is a huge area of exposed ancient bedrock, and it remains largely undeveloped and infertile today. However, there is one area that seems to break this pattern. Spanning across the border of Ontario and Quebec, this region has been much more developed than the surrounding Canadian Shield. The region is known as Canada's Great Clay Belt, and despite it being fertile, it has largely failed today. So in today's video, let's look at both the geology and human history of this Great Clay Belt. So the clay belt today spans an area of 180,000 square kilometers, and it is found in Ontario and Quebec. But what makes this belt interesting is its position within the middle of the Canadian Shield. If you didn't know, a shield is a large area of exposed ancient igneous bedrock. The Canadian Shield specifically is 8 million square kilometers and formed more than 3 billion years ago during the Archean period. It formed as a result of the collision of many tectonic plates, or smaller terrains, and it built up a large area of igneous rock, which has today turned into metamorphic rock. But one characteristic of shields is their lack of tectonic activity. The Canadian Shield has remained largely passive for 3 billion years, meaning the rocks have not folded or been subducted. Instead, over the past 3 billion years, these rocks have been heavily eroded, and all the mountains that were originally in this area have now been flattened. Despite it seeming like these eroded rocks should form soil, the Canadian Shield still has little to no soil, and the soil it does have is largely infertile. This is due to a few factors. One is poor drainage, which means that any sediment in the area is unlikely to consolidate with other sediments. Another is a lack of good organic material, which leaves the soil unable to grow most plants. And finally, the last ice age has scraped away the soil that was there originally. These three factors have acted to make the Canadian Shield a desolate place, where only the strongest coniferous trees, or other plants such as mosses and lichen, can survive. But doesn't this fact just make the clay belt even more interesting? How can there be this fertile soil within a place so opposed to it? Well, the clay belt, much like many of the strange features in Canada, formed as a result of glaciation. The last Wisconsin glaciation saw the massive Laurentide ice sheet covering all of the Canadian Shield. The ice sheet advanced over Canada and into North America until reaching its peak around 21,000 years ago. As it was advancing, it would scour or scrape the bedrock and turn many of the rocks into finer sediments. After the last glacial maximum, the Laurentide ice sheet began to retreat until it reached the clay belt region around 10,000 years ago. When the Laurentide ice sheet went into the area, it acted as a large glacial dam, preventing the drainage system from reaching Hudson Bay and instead trapping water along the margin of the ice sheet. This formed a large proglacial lake, or a lake which forms at the edge of a glacier. This lake was named Glacial Lake Ojibwe, or Lake Barlow Ojibwe. This lake is one of many proglacial lakes which formed from the Laurentide ice sheet, and it was actually the youngest of these lakes. It reached its peak size around 8,500 years ago. This lake spanned 960 kilometers from west to east and 240 kilometers from north to south. But it was within Glacial Lake Ojibwe where the clay was formed. The clay layer of the clay belt is known as Abitibi clay, and this is a glaciolacustran deposit. Glaciolacustran deposits are sediments which form in lakes but originate from glaciers. So exactly the situation we had with Glacial Lake Ojibwe. The clay specifically originated from the process of glacial abrasion. In this process, rocks, which are traveling along with the glaciers, scrape the bedrock and create fine grains of sediment, often known as glacial flour. Now, since the Laurentide ice sheet completely covered the Canadian Shield, it would have been filled with this glacial flour. And this glacial flour was then caught within the drainage system and eventually made it into Lake Ojibwe, where it was deposited on the lake bed. Finally, over the 2,500 years this clay had to form, it would compress and consolidate, forming the clay of today. At the places the lake was deepest, the clay formed a very thick layer. It reached up to 60 meters thick. The next step in the formation of the clay belt is the drainage of glacial Lake Ojibwe. Around 8,000 years ago, the ice sheet had retreated to the point where Hudson Bay was revealed. This led to the catastrophic draining of the lake into Hudson Bay. This left behind the clay as a flat, fertile layer, exposed to the surface, instead of being underneath a lake. However, there are still many remnants of this glacial Lake Ojibwe today. Most prominently, Lake Abitibi and Lake Temiskaming. You can see on maps today how the agriculture is centered around these two lakes. And the area around Lake Abitibi is actually known as the Great Clay Belt, whereas the area around Lake Temiskaming is known as the Little Clay Belt. But that has been the geology of the Great Clay Belt. The fertile clay owes its existence to glaciers, which scraped the landscape and got collected into a large proglacial lake. But despite this area seeming perfect for agriculture, today it has largely failed to maintain a consistent population. So why is this? Well, now let's look at the history of the Great Clay Belt. The area was settled by Canadian First Nations for many years before European contact. These First Nations knew about the fertility of the clay belt, but largely did not farm it since they were mostly focused on trapping. The first documentation of the fertility of the area was made by Dr. Robert Bell and Alfred Barlow, members of the Geological Survey of Canada. They visited the area in 1887. In 1899, they made a report promoting the area for agricultural settlement. Then, in 1913, Bernard Edward Furneaux traveled to the area to assess it for the creation of the National Transcontinental Railway. He noted the differences in the forests and the uniquely fertile soil. But to test the viability of the area, an experimental farm was set up in Kapuskasing. Because this farm was largely successful, the Canadian government began heavily encouraging people to settle the area. They began with sending soldiers who had just fought in World War I. This is known as the Soldier Settlement Act of 1917, and it established the Kapuskasing Soldier Colony. But despite the soldiers being paid for developing the land, just 3 years later, in 1920, only 9 of the more than 100 original settlers remained. This failure, though, did not stop the Canadian government from trying to develop the area. In fact, encouragement of the area spanned from 1903 to 1931. In Ontario, the discovery of cobalt along the Temiskaming and Northern Ontario Railway led to a silver rush and a small population boom near the Little Clay Belt. In Quebec, similar development happened around Lake Temiskaming, but colonization societies and the Catholic Church led to more successful settlements around the Great Clay Belt as well. Also, the construction of the National Transcontinental Railway in 1913 led to the founding of several different townships in the area, many of which exist today as the settlements of Amos, Lassar, and many others. The encouragement of settlement by Quebec can be seen today on maps. If you look near Lake Abitibi, you can see how the Quebec side has much more developed land than the Ontario side. For many years, the farming of this land looked very promising. An estimated 806,000 hectares of the clay belt were cleared of forests and farmed. But despite this, in the 1930s, settlement would virtually stop, and the area found itself in decline. So why did this seemingly promising area decline? Well, it is because of its unique environment. For one, the growing season is very short due to it being so far north. It lasts only around 100 days, spanning from May 28th to September 9th. This significantly limits the crops that can be grown there. Today, it is primarily soybeans, grain, and vegetables. Also, sometimes there would be summer frosts, or conversely, significant dry seasons, which also severely discouraged farmers. On these dry seasons, wildfires would ravage the area, including the devastating Great Fire of 1922, which burned many towns along the Little Clay Belt and is labeled as one of the 10 worst natural disasters in Canadian history. And finally, the clay here also has bad drainage. This means that the water essentially gets trapped on top of the clay and forms extensive peat bogs. So this means that if you wanted to develop the land, you would not only have to clear forests, but you would also have to clear these large bogs as well. These factors just made the clay belt not appealing to settle in at all, even to people who were being paid to settle there. One of those original soldiers who settled in Kapuskasing was asked why he abandoned the area. He stated, "There are 7 months of snow, 2 months of rain, and the remainder mosquitoes and black flies." So definitely not a pleasant or inviting area, according to this guy at least. So despite the clay belt appearing as a promising fertile area within the middle of Canada, it actually causes much difficulty to settle. However, the area isn't only used for agriculture. The mining and lumber industries have proved more successful than farming. Today, both clay belts have cyclical boom and bust cycles of population, depending on the value of paper and minerals. So what is the clay belt like today? Well, today it still has a noticeable population compared to the surrounding Canadian Shield. In population density maps, you can see the settlement, primarily in the more developed Quebec area, near Lake Abitibi. And the industries of farming, mining, and paper are centered around a few towns, most notably Timmins, Kapuskasing, Cochrane, Amos, and Temiskaming Shores. The area to the south of the clay belt actually has many precious metals. I already mentioned the cobalt near Temiskaming Lake, but there's also a large belt of gold known as the Abitibi Gold Belt. There are also deposits of copper, zinc, lead, and many other metals that make this area valuable. The primary mining hub of this area is Timmins, which mostly explains why it has the highest population of the towns I mentioned previously. I also mentioned that the area is big on lumber. The forests here are largely coniferous, primarily black and white spruce, and these woods are used for paper and pulp. So despite the area having declined in population, there is still mining and lumbering. And there have even been recent efforts to revitalize agriculture in the area. This has been primarily promoted by the Northern Ontario Heritage Fund Corporation. It is assumed that as the planet warms, the clay belt will be more viable for agriculture, and the growing season will become longer. If corn starts being able to be grown in the area, it may very well have a large population boom. So currently, the clay belt's future is unknown. While it has failed in the past for agriculture, it may very well have success in the future. But overall, the clay belt holds an interesting geologic and human history that should not be overlooked. That's going to be all for today's video. If you learned something new, please subscribe, and I will see you guys in the next video.